Nothing's Changed by Tatamkhulu Afrika. I think it's an interesting poem in that it deals with his sort of anger and frustration about a situation that he sees, and that he's almost powerless to do anything about. I mean, the title, you know, really negative, nothing's changed. And I think that negativity flows through the poem. And in some ways it's quite gloomy, and like some of the others where, you know, they've obviously got a strong feeling about it, but sometimes they're a little bit powerless to do anything about it.
Similar to Scavengers, isn't it? Where the inequalities between the rich and the poor. And I think this shows inequalities between the rich and the poor in South Africa, and where apartheid should have stopped, but however it's still continuing. And maybe the poet is really concerned and he's angered about what's happening in that society.
Yeah, I agree, but I think the difference between those two poems is nothing's changed. You've got that more sense of aggression and anger, where in Two Scavengers there seems to be a placid kind of observation about it, rather than that personal anger that seems to really come through in Nothing's Changed. I think it's interesting picking up on the glass idea in that image, because although there is a physical separation there, glass, obviously, you can see through it. So it's to what extent people can see that the inequality is still there and things haven't changed, and to what extent that glass is
a barrier.
A barrier, absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I think what's interesting about the context of the poem is that living in Africa, living in South Africa at that time, I mean, he could have passed for a white individual, but he made the choice to side with the ANC.
And I think you do need to take in his personal experience and to what extent the poem is autobiographical, don't you? To have an understanding as to what his message actually is.
I think also he's trying to educate the reader. He likes to take us on a journey, and he tells us very vividly what District 6 was like. It's described in very negative terms, the amiable weeds, the crunch, the purple flowering, somewhere that's not been looked after. And gradually it builds up to his anger, and uses the word "and" several times. So it shows how angry he is at this particular
and
society.
the continuation of his observations, you know. I think the repetition of "and" in its simplicity allows to actually feel his observations, and it's kind of a continual kind of list. There's a number of different things that he's observing. And even though it's simple in its structure, I think that serves to highlight his real feelings.
And because it's a narrative, because he's taking us on a journey, I think it compares quite well to Night of the Scorpion, where he tells a story of his mother, and also Island Man for its descriptive quality in describing these places.
I like how the poets use a simile to describe the whites only flaring like a flag. And where it's described as it squats, that sounds very derogatory, that term, as if it shouldn't be there.
I think it's an interesting choice of word though, because you can look at that in different ways, can't you? Squats as in someone who shouldn't be there, or squats as in a kind of trying to make yourself small as well. So I think, although there is I think the main idea is that someone squatting who shouldn't be there, as well the kind of negative connotation of someone trying to make themselves small there as well, I think is interesting. And it's quite a solid word, squats as well. You know, it's that kind of solid, making yourself fit in.
I mean, yes, and that idea of being brash with glass, that sort of arrogance, you know, it doesn't deserve to be there. And I think it comes back to this idea that, you know, District 6 was bulldozed to make way for this whites-only development, and yet clearly nothing has happened there. It's just this inn, and, you know, very sort of, it's gone to sort of scrubland, really.
I like as well how the poets use a contrast to describe just down the road, it's not very far away, the Working Man's Cafe, and how that contrast is being made, where this is described, the whites only in positive terms, where the Working Man's Cafe is described in very negative terms.
How do you mean negative?
Well, by the bunny chows, the cheap food, in contrast to the hot cuisine, and the way that they haven't got anything to wipe their hands on, they've just got to wipe their hands on their jeans.
It's interesting you say negative, because is it a negative description of the Working Man's Cafe? Because, or is it not celebrating the ordinariness of their culture and of that working class group, that there is just an ordinariness about it?
Well, I disagree, because I know for fact, I wouldn't like to go to a cafe where somebody spits on the floor. So maybe they haven't got the facilities in the working man's cafe, in contrast to the whites only inn.
I think later on, you're absolutely right in the fact that spitting on the floor, it is a derogatory description of someone who doesn't have the manners and the class that there seems to be in this beautiful, elaborate restaurant that is in place for.
Yeah, but I mean, there's an honesty about the working man's cafe, whereas the whites only inn with its descriptions of the crushed ice white glass. I was going to use that word white very ironically, you know, and the linen falls, and then the single rows, you know, just this kind of overly fancy sort of restaurant.
Yeah, and the symbolism there as well of that single row.
And it's totally incongruous to its surroundings, which are obviously run down area.
Yeah, and I think, sorry, I was just going to say that the incongruous restaurant there is also a metaphor for how he feels about these two groups and how the whites only inn have come into this land, which previously was a group of multicultural area, and people were quite happy to live there. Cultures completely different to one another but living in harmony before the government decided that this should be a whites only area and bulldozed it, ripping apart, you know, culture and community.
I mean, I think what's interesting in the first stanza is, you know, where you've got the small round hard stones click, and then the cuffs and cans and crunch, that hard alliteration on the C, almost like he's unwelcome there, even though he knows it really well.
Yeah, and there's something very clipped, isn't there, about the language that he chooses in, you know, a lot of it's monosyllabic, in that there's that kind of does underpin the anger as well. I think you feel that. He's kind of spitting the words out.
To enforce his anger the way the society.
And I think that runs through towards the end of the poem, where often we can see the conclusion referring to his message, where we have this language repetition of small mean mouth. And I think the emphasis there through the repetition is underpinning the real feelings at the heart of it.
You know, it's such a striking image. I know we've talked about it before, but the hands burning for a stone or a bomb, you know, the desire to absolutely destroy it, really, you know, but the inability as well, because he's reverted to a boy again.
Yeah,
you can't act,
and I think that's interesting as well, how your surroundings can reduce you to childhood, and I think that's probably interesting. You could see that throughout some of the other poems as well, how memories can be triggered.
So we see the memory in Island Man, the sort of the memory in Night of the Scorpion, and then the memories of what were they like as well, you know, the question.
Okay. Right, well, I noticed in the second stanza that and is repeated not once but 4 times in the poem, and that clearly emphasises the anger of the poet and how he feels about what's going on in South Africa. He can't do anything about it. He feels that he's unable to act, but obviously he's able to voice his concerns in his poem that what is happening in South Africa is wrong, and something in this society really needs to change.
And I think it's also interesting, picking up on that, the use of the colon, and then how he then gives us this list. And I think the list is kind of long and simple, yet really evocative in really pinning down his observations, and it's not just one thing, it's a multitude of things that he's recognising.
There's a number of instances of sort of word repetition within the poem as well. I mean, in stanza 1 he talks about the weeds, and that comes up again in stanza 3. He talks about the glass in line 30, that comes up in line 47 again. Why do we think that he keeps returning to these things, these images?
Because inequality in that particular society, for me, I think it's not changed, and it's cyclical, because he wants it to change, and apartheid should have changed, but in reality, for black people and ethnic minorities, it hasn't changed, and is angered about what's going on in that particular society.
I think interesting use of glass as a symbol is something that's seen across literature in lots of different things, and I'm just thinking about how we have this idea of the glass ceiling within business, and how that is, you know, people can only get to a certain point, but then to what extent are you able to break through the glass? Is it easy to break through the glass? Is it easy to cross divides? Or is actually that glass firm and hard, and those barriers are always going to be there, but people are ignoring them.
I totally agree with you, because what he does, he touches the glass, because he makes it in the final stanza, his mouth is against the glass, but it's a small O, but he backs away from the glass. It's as if this barrier is never going to break. So it's as if inequality for him personally.
Just picking up on that as well, small mean O, and he capitalises the O.
Yeah.
So it's not small, is it?
Yeah.
This is something that's very powerful and significant for him. And he's describing it as small, but it's not small. There's nothing small about this at all, is there?
And then, I mean, in terms of the repetition, it links really well to two scavengers in a truck, because you get the repeated images there as well of the red plastic blazers or the elegant Mercedes and the elegant couple. So really repetition is something that these poets are really interested in reinforcing.
And I think that's the key message there, that when poets are using repetition, it is to reinforce their point. So where we are seeing that, it is a big flag to say, this is really important, this is something central to my feelings in the poem.
And also as well, we're trying to educate the reader as well. We as individuals should do something for this.
And then, I mean, we talked about earlier the sort of cyclical nature of the poem, how it comes back to the statement and nothing has changed, really reinforcing that message. I mean, the stanzas themselves are all of an equal length, apart from stanza 4, lines 25 to 26.
And I think interesting as well, we've got another use of the colon there. So he's going to explain to us something, but there is no explanation there, just a simple fact. We know where we belong. It's
almost a mirror of stanza 2. No board says it is, no sign says it is, colon. Except here, it's just so much shorter.
Yeah, so it's that same message again about people are ignoring this. You know, he wants people to stand up. He's writing this poem to raise our awareness, but still,
nothing's
people are
being
ignoring
done.
it. Nothing's being changed.
So maybe the shortness of that stanza is showing his increasing frustration, that now, you know, it's getting to boiling point. When I read the poem, I think that actually, in terms of the context, written in the early 90s, it's still very relevant to South Africa today, because you still find great economic inequality in South Africa, you know, which lots of poor people, a small minority of rich people, which does go back to the apartheid time, simply because the black Africans and those of ethnic minorities, you know, still haven't been given the opportunities. It's kind of historical. And I think from that sort of perspective, this poem is about more than just race in South Africa. I think we see inequality everywhere.
Yeah, so in that sense, it's not just something that applies to one country, it's in every single country, isn't it? It's not just in the countries that historically we can say there was an incident or an event there. It can be seen in every single country, which is interesting when you look at two scavengers.
And also limbo as well, you know, the inequality that is suggested there, the treatment of one group by another, and reference obviously in Vultures when talking about the Belsen camp and the Jews, the World War II, and in What Were They Like as well, you know, the treatment of the Vietnamese people by both the American army and by the Viet Cong.
And of course the poverty, I think you need to mention blessing as well, because it is that case of this pipe that's running through there that is just somebody else. And yet you've got those people there where...
I refer to limbo as well, the inequality where the black people were taken into slavery and they had no choice.
Now what do you think about nothing's changed? How do you respond to it?
I feel very concerned about what's been going on in South Africa, and obviously watching the World Cup and seeing some of the slum areas that black people are living in. You can clearly relate it to the point nothing has changed, and it's so unfair. And you know, society, in the 21st century, really we should be doing something about it.
I mean, I think it's very bleak, isn't it?
It is very bleak, but at the same time, I think, have some things changed?
Some things have changed, but
not
enough.
It is a very negative poem, it is very personal, but surely societies have come on to a certain degree where we have made changes for more focus towards equality for all. And although it is very bleak and it's his personal experience, for me, I sometimes read it and think, well, maybe it is a little bit too negative and pessimistic, and surely societies have evolved to a certain degree where we are at least fighting and trying to make some changes.